Picture this. The year is 1220. You are standing on the walls of Samarkand, the jewel of the Silk Road. Below you, an endless sea of felt tents stretches to the horizon. The Mongol army surrounds your city like a living noose. You can hear your daughter crying in the room behind you. She is 16 years old. Yesterday, she was learning poetry in the madrasa. Today she is praying the walls hold. They will not. Here is what you need to understand about Samarkand before everything changed. This was not just another city. For 2,000 years, it had been the beating heart of Central Asian civilization. The libraries held manuscripts from Greece, Persia, India, and China. The markets traded in silk, spices, and ideas that connected 3 continents. The population was approximately 100,000 souls. Scholars, merchants, artisans, farmers. The city's gardens were famous across the Islamic world. Poets wrote that walking through Samarkand was like walking through paradise. Think about what is about to be lost. The siege begins in March 1220. The Mongol general Genghis Khan demands surrender. The city's governor, Turkan Khatun, refuses. She is the mother of the Khwarezmian Shah. She believes the walls are strong enough. She believes help is coming. She is wrong about both. By the 5th day, Mongol siege engineers have diverted the water supply. By the 7th day, they have built siege towers that match the height of the walls. The defenders fight with everything they have. Boiling oil, arrows, stones, desperation. On March 16, 1220, the walls are breached. Now pay attention to what happens next, because this is where the machine starts. The Mongol army does not just pour into the city in chaotic violence. What follows is systematic, organized, and documented by multiple contemporary sources, including the Persian historian Juvaini and the Arab chronicler Ibn al-Athir. The population is divided into categories. Adult men of military age are separated immediately. Approximately 30,000 are marched to the city's outskirts. What happens to them is recorded in brutal detail by Juvaini. Mass execution by sword. Their bodies left in piles that contemporary accounts say could be smelled for miles. Here is where it gets more sinister. The remaining population, women, children, elderly, and skilled craftsmen, are assembled in the city's main square. The square that 7 days ago hosted poetry competitions and trade negotiations. Now it is a processing center. Mongol administrators move through the crowd with translators and record keepers. They are not slaughtering randomly. They are categorizing. Think about what this tells us. This was not rage. This was policy. Women are divided into 3 groups based on age and appearance. Contemporary Persian sources, though written carefully to avoid explicit detail, make the system clear through euphemism and implication. Group 1 consists of women deemed attractive by Mongol standards. Estimates from the sources suggest 8,000 to 10,000 women. Ages ranged from early teens to 30s. These women are marked and separated. Here is what the sources tell us happened. They are distributed among Mongol officers and soldiers according to a predetermined hierarchy. Senior commanders receive first choice. The distribution is recorded administratively. Names, ages, and physical descriptions are logged by Mongol scribes. But here is what should terrify you about this system. This distribution was not for immediate assault. It was for long-term possession. These women were being absorbed into the Mongol camp structure as property. The sources describe a process where women were assigned to specific tents, given new clothes in Mongol style, and expected to perform domestic and intimate duties for their captors. Archaeological evidence from Mongol campsites across Central Asia reveals the infrastructure that supported this system. Separate tent sections for captive women. Cooking areas. Storage for supplies. This was not improvised. It was designed. If you believe the documented records of history's most calculated atrocities must be remembered, consider subscribing to this channel. Your support helps uncover the systematic horrors that official histories try to erase. Let us talk about the second group. Women over 40 or those deemed less desirable were placed in a different category. Approximately 15,000 women according to Giovanni's estimates. These women faced a different fate, though arguably no less horrifying. They were enslaved for labor. The Mongol army required massive logistical support, cooking for hundreds of thousands of soldiers, processing animal hides, making felt for tents, grinding grain, hauling water. The sources describe these women being forced to march with the army as it moved to its next target. Think about the psychology here. You are watching your city burn. Your husband is dead. Your sons are dead. And now you are being forced to cook food for the men who killed them, to repair their equipment, to serve the machine that destroyed everything you knew. The mortality rate for these enslaved women was catastrophic. Giovanni notes that by the time the Mongol army reached Balkh, 3 months later, fewer than half the women captured at Samarkand remained alive. They died from exhaustion, disease, exposure, and violence during the march. Now we come to the third category, and this is where the historical sources become most difficult to read. Children and young adolescents were separated into their own group. The numbers are harder to establish, but estimates suggest 10,000 to 15,000 children. Some were kept as slaves. Others were absorbed into Mongol households to be raised as Mongol subjects, their original identities deliberately erased. Here is what makes this especially sinister. The Mongol Empire had a specific policy regarding the children of conquered peoples. Boys above a certain age were killed to prevent future rebellion. Boys below that age were enslaved or adopted. Girls were kept for future use as the empire expanded. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was demographic warfare. The intent was to erase Samarkand not just as a city, but as a people. To break the chain of cultural transmission so thoroughly that within a generation, there would be no one left who remembered what Samarkand had been. Contemporary sources give us glimpses of individual stories that bring the horror into focus. A woman named Turkan, a merchant's wife, mentioned briefly in Giovanni's chronicle. Before the siege, she managed her husband's textile business. She spoke Persian, Arabic, and Sogdian. She wrote poetry. After the conquest, she is mentioned only as property distributed to a Mongol captain. Then she disappears from the historical record entirely. Another fragment comes from Ibn al-Athiri. He records the account of a survivor who escaped months later. She describes watching her sister, age 14, being selected during the initial sorting. She never saw her again. These were not nameless masses. They were individuals with names, families, skills, and dreams. The historical record reduced them to numbers and categories. By late March 1220th, Samarkand was a ghost city. The Mongol army had moved on, taking approximately 30,000 captive women and children with them. The libraries were burned. The irrigation systems were destroyed. The gardens that poets compared to paradise were trampled into mud by thousands of horses. But here is what the sources reveal about the longer-term fate of Samarkand's women. Scattered references in Persian, Chinese, and Mongol sources over the following decades mention women from Samarkand living in Mongol camps from Mongolia to Hungary. Some appear in household records. Others appear in passing references that mention their origin. A Mongol military register from 1232, discovered in Chinese archives, lists Samarkand women as part of a supply inventory alongside horses and weapons. 12 years after the city fell, they were still being categorized as plunder. Think about that level of dehumanization. What happened to these specific women? Most we will never know. The sources go silent. The machine moved on to new targets, new cities, new populations to categorize and destroy. But occasionally, fragments surfaced else. A trade document from 1247 mentions a woman identified as originally from Samarkand working as a translator in the Mongol court. She would have been a child during the conquest. Somehow, she survived during the conquest. Somehow she learned Mongol. Somehow she made herself useful enough to avoid being discarded. Was that survival or a different kind of death. Archaeological excavations in Samarkand over the last 30 years have uncovered evidence of the 1220 conquest. Mass graves outside the city walls, burned residential districts, layers of ash in the archaeological record that align precisely with the year 1220. In 2011, excavations near what had been the main square uncovered a stone marker. The inscription is fragmentary, but experts translated a portion that reads, "Here stood the souls of Samarkand." It was erected sometime after the Mongol conquest by survivors who returned to rebuild, a memorial to the 40,000 who never came back. Here's what we need to confront about this history. The Mongol conquests were not chaotic barbarian raids. They were the most effective military machine the medieval world had ever seen. And part of that effectiveness came from systematic terror applied with bureaucratic precision. What happened to the women of Samarkand was not an unfortunate side effect of war. It was a weapon. It was calculated to break resistance in the next city by making sure everyone knew what awaited them if they fought. And it worked. After Samarkand fell, city after city across Central Asia and Persia surrendered without fighting. The machine had taught them what resistance cost. The historical sources documenting Samarkand's fall were written primarily by Persian and Arab historians years or decades after the events. Some of them wrote under Mongol rule, which may have affected what they chose to emphasize or obscure. But despite potential biases and the medieval tendency toward exaggeration, the core facts are corroborated across multiple independent sources from different cultural perspectives. The siege happened, the categorization happened, the systematic distribution and enslavement happened. Giovanni's chronicle is especially valuable because he had access to Mongol administrative records. He was not just recording rumors. He was describing documented policy. Modern historians debate the exact numbers. Some argue the sources exaggerated. Others believe the horror was actually worse than recorded, because the sources, written in Islamic contexts, would have been reluctant to detail the full extent of sexual violence against Muslim women. What is not debated is the systematic nature of what occurred. So here is the question we are left with: how do we remember an atrocity when the victims were deliberately erased from history? When the sources reduced them to numbers and categories? When even their names were stripped away and replaced with property designations? We do exactly what we are doing now. We pull the fragments together. We name what happened. We refuse to let the machine have the final word. The women of Samarkand existed. They had names we will never know. They had lives that were destroyed with bureaucratic efficiency. They deserve more than a footnote in a history of Mongol military tactics. Samarkand itself survived eventually. The city was rebuilt over decades. It became a great center of learning again under Timur in the 14th century. The monuments that tourists visit today, the Registan, the Shah-i-Zinda, rose from those ashes. But the Samarkand that fell in 1220 never came back. An entire generation was erased. The cultural continuity was broken. The machine achieved its goal. If this exposed a chapter of history you never learned in school, subscribe and turn on notifications. We are uncovering the systematic horrors that textbooks buried. Drop a comment with your thoughts on how we should remember victims whose names history erased. I will see you in the next investigation.